right, well, it is now my pleasure to introduce our final keynote speaker of the day. This is Dr. Joe DeCarolis. He's an internationally recognized leader with technical expertise in energy systems, climate change, computing, and public policy, and is now the head of the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. So prior to becoming department head, he spent 4 years at the Environmental Protection Agency and 17 years at NC State. Go Wolfpack. From 2022 to 2025, DeCarolis served in a presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed role as administrator of the Energy Information Administration, the official statistical and analytical agency within the Department of Energy. In this role, he led 350 federal employees and 300 contractors with a $135 million annual budget. We are extremely lucky to have Joe on the faculty at CMU and leading our world-renowned Department of Engineering and Public Policy. Dr. DeCarolis, the stage is yours.
All right, well, it's an honor to be here. I realize it's late afternoon, and I'm gonna warn you, I've got a bunch of figures, so you might wanna help yourself to the candy bar before we get started. Okay, so there's a couple things I want to do in this presentation. I want to present some recent trends that we're seeing in the electric power sector, and then I also want to talk about how data centers are impacting those trends through 2030. And because I spent time at EIA, I'm going to tell a lot of that early part of the story on recent trends with their data. So these are just some of the high-level trends that we've been talking about all week, right? One is that the grid is in a period of very rapid change. On the demand side, we know that electricity demand from data centers in particular is accelerating. On the supply side, technology innovation has led to cheap renewables, which have been displacing coal and to some degree natural gas. But there's also a lot of legacy capacity, fossil nuclear capacity that remains on the grid. And so the question is, with this rapidly rising electricity demand from data centers, how might electricity supply change in order to meet that demand, and what are the implications? So I want to start by talking about how electricity supply has changed over time, but before I even get to that, you know, there's a tendency, we've been talking a lot about data centers and the electric power grid, and it's easy to get a little bit of tunnel vision. So I want to zoom way out and look at the energy system, the US energy system as a whole. So this was a Sankey diagram that we put together at EIA with 2023 data. What we're looking at here is energy consumption flowing from primary energy on the left-hand side to the end-use sectors on the right-hand side, and the width of those lines is proportional to the magnitude of the flow. And there's a lot of interesting things to point out here. You can see, first of all, that some of that primary energy is being converted into electricity, which you can see near the bottom of the plot, that gray box. The other thing is that fossil fuels on the left-hand side loom really large, right? Those petroleum and natural gas boxes. It's something, given the conflict in Iran right now, that many people are very worried about. It's still, those sources still make up a big part of our energy supply. That said, those primary energy flows, because of thermodynamics, a half to, 2/3 of that energy coming from petroleum, natural gas, and coal is being wasted as heat. So if we're gonna change the energy system and reduce the consumption of those, we don't necessarily need to replace all of that primary energy depending on the sources that we decide to use. So for example, if you look at renewables in the green box on the left, we're not getting those same kinds of thermodynamic losses. So this is a good frame to keep in mind. If we want to transition to lower zero carbon, basically we have to reshuffle those primary energy boxes in order to meet demand. And a lot of the analysis that's taken place tells us a really clear signal. We need clean electricity and we need to electrify the end use sectors, right? So again, that's going to mean reconfiguring the boxes in the flows in this diagram. The other thing is what I'm going to talk about, which is this rapidly increasing electricity demand from data centers, which is placing a lot of pressure on the electricity sector and will be over the next few years. So as I move forward here and we talk about the electric sector, again, it's that gray box right there near the bottom of the diagram that I'm keyed in on. This is showing historical electricity generation data from EIA going all the way back to the 1950s. And you can see there were many, many decades where things were kind of progressing, you know, relatively slowly. You see things were steady. There was this increase in coal and nuclear, but things were not changing all that rapidly. We had large dispatchable power plants. Much of the infrastructure that we installed, transmission and distribution systems, the large generators, were all built during that era, right? And you can look more recently, say since 2010, and this is, I mentioned in the first slide that there's been a lot of rapid changes in the electricity sector. Well, look what's been happening. We've had this rapid decline in coal, this rise in natural gas, and that trade-off has largely been due to hydraulic fracturing, which has produced a lot of domestic natural gas, which has displaced coal. But you also see this rise in renewables, that green line. And I want to zero in on this period since 2010. This is looking at the change in electric generating capacity since 2010. This is the cumulative change. So we're adding up the change over time until we get through 2025, okay? And this is capacity. This is in gigawatts. So back to Costa's early talk this morning, he said, you know, the Hoover Dam was it 2 gigawatts, right? So 2 gigawatts, we're talking changes on the order of 100 gigawatts. So for example, if you look at natural gas, we've added, since 2010, 100 gigawatts of capacity. That's like 50 Hoover Dams. But we've also added 100 gigawatts each of wind and solar during that same period. And it's largely, again, come at the expense of coal, which where we've retired about 150 gigawatts over that same period. You can also start to see this rapid rise in battery storage because it has this nice diurnal complement with solar energy. So we're building a lot of renewables and gas. This is EIA data looking at what is going to be put on the grid this year. And this is actually survey data. So EIA puts surveys into the field and asks utilities, what do you plan to build and what do you plan to retire? And so you can see on the left-hand side, these are planned additions. Yellow is solar, green is wind, and purple is batteries. And you can see that that makes up the vast majority of the capacity that's going to come online this year. The Inflation Reduction Act is still in place. You also see some large combined cycle units there, those light brown circles. When you look on the right-hand side at planned retirements, it's basically all natural gas and coal, mostly coal. Okay, so a very different picture between additions and retirements. That's what's been happening on the supply side. On the demand side, this is how electricity demand has changed over roughly the last decade. This is taken also from EIA. They published it today in Energy article just a week or so ago. And this is drawing on their short-term energy outlook, which forecasts energy in the US through the end of the following year. So in this case, it's running through the end of 2027. And this particular analysis was focused on electricity demand. You've heard similar numbers yesterday and today, but from their estimate is from 2005 to 2019, electricity demand grew at about 0.1% every year. Okay? But then from 2020 to 2025, nationally, electricity demand grew at about 1.7%. Looking over from last year through the end of next year, they're estimating that ERCOT, which is the Texas grid, electricity demand is gonna grow by 10%, and PJM in the mid-Atlantic is gonna grow by another 3%. Data centers will likely grow from about 4 to 5% of total US electricity demand today to something like 18 to 14% by 2030. Now, I've added on here another set of projections, which is what we're using in our analysis, and these demand projections for electricity are based in part on estimates coming from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which did a report on data centers. So Berkeley Lab released this report in 2024, and their methodology is they look at the shipment of IT equipment around the country, and then they try and project that into the future. So they're literally looking at things like, how many GPUs is NVIDIA going to ship around the United States, and how is that expected to change over time? They also make a bunch of assumptions about cooling equipment, efficiency, and so forth, and that gives this range of electricity generation through 2030. They also, as part of that report, estimated electricity demand from cryptocurrency mining. That's included in the blue lines here, but I've also broken it out as that red line at the bottom. So 17% of this electricity demand in 2030, roughly speaking, if these projections are accurate, would come just from cryptocurrency mining. And this is something I spent a lot of time on at EIA. It was a big deal, and then ChatGPT was released, and everybody started talking about data centers, and we kind of lost the thread on cryptocurrency mining, but it is there, and we don't know how much electricity it's consuming, so this is just a rough estimate. If you look at the mid projection by 2030, and you divide that by this 2025 electricity generation, it's something like 18%. So that just that mid projection gets you almost to 20% of 2025 electricity demand. So again, it's growing quite rapidly. So what are the implications of all of this demand growth given how the supply side has been changing? To do that, we run an open source energy system model called TMOA. It stands for Tools for Energy Model Optimization and Analysis. This is a model that I started developing with my team at NC State, roughly 15 years ago, and we've continued to apply it. Here at Carnegie Mellon, it's used as the primary analytical tool under the Open Energy Outlook, which is a key initiative of the Scott Institute. Paulina Jaramillo, who led a panel this morning, is the co-lead on this project, and it's also been supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. I could bore you to tears with all the details on how the model works and all the input data and so forth, but I'm gonna just leave it at this. It's a data-intensive model. We have to feed it data on projected electricity demand, on fuel prices, technology characteristics, all the things that engineers love to talk about, like CapEx, operations and maintenance costs, conversion efficiencies, emissions factors, existing capacity, and so forth. And then existing policy. We want to parameterize the model with policy. In most of the results I'm going to show you, we removed, for example, the IRA incentives because they were undone by the One Big Beautiful Bill. And basically what the model is doing is a capacity expansion over time. It's trying to figure out the least cost way to generate electricity, again, subject to whatever policy and physical constraints we feed it. This is the last bit of input that I'm going to show you. So we took those national scale projections for electricity demand, and then we distributed that data center and cryptocurrency demand across these 26 regions. And we distributed it in proportion to where the current data center and cryptocurrency mining demand is taking place. So you can see a big chunk of that increase in demand is happening in PJM, as well as in ERCOT, so Mid-Atlantic and Texas. And again, this is an input assumption to the model. This is the first result. This is looking at just the incremental electricity generation you need in order to operate the data center. So we run it without data center load, with data center load. This is how that load is being met. You see that a lot of probably the most prominent feature is those brown bars, which are natural gas. Nationally, natural gas generation meets about 70% of that data center demand. Coal is about 14%, solar 7%, wind 8%. You can see that there's a pretty substantial increase in coal in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Southeast. It's those black bars. This isn't building new coal capacity. This is just delaying the retirement of existing coal capacity and utilizing it at a higher capacity factor. Same with the natural gas. This isn't all new build. A lot of this is just utilizing the existing capacity at a higher capacity factor. You do see substantial renewables in the Northeast corridor, and a lot of that has to do with RGGI. RGGI is Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it caps CO2 emissions in those states. So they sort of have to use renewables in order to meet that demand. And again, remember, a lot of the federal incentives for renewables have been removed. One of the strengths of the model is that we could do lots of sensitivity and uncertainty analysis. This is a simple scenario analysis where we've got those three different demand levels. We add the federal incentives back in. We look at low and high natural gas prices. We look at high capital costs for combined and simple cycle gas turbines. We look at different ways of distributing the demand. And you see this pretty consistent pattern that we're using a lot of coal and natural gas capacity to meet the incremental demand coming from the data centers. There is a sizable share of renewables, and you can see that that increases. For example, when we add federal incentives back for renewables, you can see that the share of wind and solar grow, and same for high gas prices. If we have high natural gas prices, which we are almost certainly going to have now, you can see that it likewise increases the penetration of renewables. This is looking at the increase in electricity costs across these 26 different regions. Across the various scenarios that we modeled, we find that data center demand could increase electricity costs somewhere between 6 and 30% by 2030. And you can see that the electricity costs, particularly in PJM-D, that's the Dominion territory, increases pretty substantially. It's actually an increase of 60% over the case where we have no data center demand. This is CO2 emissions. Overall, again, across all the scenarios we ran, we found that CO2 emissions due to data centers could increase national CO2 emissions between 13 and 28%, depending on the scenario. The thing that stands out very obviously on the map is what's happening in PJM West. And there's two things going on. One is there's high data center demand, and there's a lot of coal capacity. So that's where we're increasing the capacity factors of those existing coal plants in order to meet demand. I'll just conclude with a few high-level insights. I think for a long time we assumed that there was power sector decarbonization that was happening. It was almost on autopilot, in large part because we had cleaner natural gas displacing coal. Renewables have been growing very steadily. And I think with this data center demand, it kind of throws that into question. We need megawatt hours, we need them quickly, and it's a pretty obvious solution to increase the utilization of the capacity that's already on the grid. So again, demand is met by an increase of coal and gas capacity that's already on the grid, some new builds, and there are also substantial increases in renewables, particularly in the east. And we do see a lot of regional variations. The highest impacts are where most of that data center demand is located. And again, we don't exactly know where future data center demand is going to occur, but if you sort of assume that it's going to occur where it has been occurring, then we see those biggest impacts in PJM and ERCOT. And the final thing I'll say is uncertainty is really high. So there's a reason we could run this model through 2050 if we wanted to, but the uncertainty is simply too high. And in most of my conversations, I think we have a decent idea of what we think could happen over the next few years, but beyond that, we just don't know. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, any questions? Briggs.
Sure. Hi, Briggs White, recently with DOE, and question about the coal plants. So totally understand the increase in capacity factor, but a lot of these coal plants are pretty old. They're 50 years old on average or so. So that can't go on for forever. They're going to be breaking down as they're cycling and so on. So do you think maybe 10 years from now that'll kind of go away and be replaced by new capacity coming on the grid or something else?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's a lot of detail in the model. So for each of those 26 regions, there's clusters of different clusters based on different types of power plants. So we're not modeling individual power plants, but they're being clustered together. So you're going to have clusters of coal capacity in certain regions that are newer or older, and it's utilizing the coal plants that have better performance. But yes, I agree. I mean, I think over the next decade or so, it's unlikely that we'll see that capacity online. And hopefully something, we figure out solutions that help break this bottleneck, either on the supply side or the demand side.
Hi, Mike Zimmerman, Environmental Defense Fund. I have two questions that are really, really short. So one's just clarifying. Slide 141 showing the cost impacts. Is that inclusive of transmission costs?
Okay, great question. And I didn't have time to get into all the details. It includes the cost of transmission when you're building new renewables. So there's a spur line that will take renewables to a demand center. Because we're only looking through 2030, the model can expand transmission capacity between regions, but we turn that off.
Okay.
We're assuming like in the next few years, you're not going to get major increases in transmission. And if we did that, if you assume that that's going to happen over the next few years, then it might even out some of these impacts.
Interesting. Okay. Does the model consider deployment of demand response energy efficiency as a resource, and if not, why not?
No. So the simplifying assumption here is we have exogenous electricity demand. Now we are modeling 8760 hours in a year, so we're getting a nice load shape, but we're not looking, in this particular study, we're not looking at, for example, load flexibility. And I think that would help with your megawatts, but you still have to get the megawatt hours from somewhere. So, but yes, simplifying assumption that demand is exogenous and we're not looking at flexibility or response.
Related to that question, and maybe it's the same answer, storage.
Yeah, so there is. I didn't present the battery storage results, but yes, there is battery storage, and within the model, there's a storage algorithm that stores dispatches every hour, from hour to hour.
Also on the cost piece, I'm wondering, how do you consider cost allocation, or like a data center bringing its own generation online versus being distributed across the ratepayers?
Yeah, so I mean, in this case, to derive the cost, we're just looking at this. We're looking at it from a systems level. So this is just the marginal cost of generating the electricity, and we're not accounting for data centers bringing their own load. But what I would argue is, to the degree that happens, then you're, in a very simple way, you're kind of moving between these scenarios, right? So like if data centers all brought their own generation behind the meter, then this problem basically goes away. And then it's just it's a matter of degrees, right? Some percentage of data centers do that, and so maybe you move from mid to low or high to mid or something like that. But again, it's a simplifying assumption.
Do you see anything coming along that'll improve the decarbonization situation significantly?
I mean, I think taking away incentives for renewables, and this administration, trying to stymie the siting of renewables is not helpful. At a time when we need more capacity. I mean, they're talking about using reciprocating engines, like retired jet engines from retired aircraft. I mean, like anywhere, right? At a time like that, I think to restrict a source of supply is not particularly helpful. So I think bringing those incentives back. Of course, there's been also a lot of talk of transmission. We need to fix the interconnection queue, build transmission. I think all of those things definitely help. And then I think there's this immediate problem of what do we do over the next few years to try and meet this demand. And then there's, if you expand the time horizon, there's a lot more options. I think, for example, considering nuclear and small modular reactors, all those things come into play, but not to 2030, in my opinion. Uh-oh.
Andrew, I was going to ask a related question. Do you see any scenarios in which the administration would back off on its restore incentives for renewables,
No. I just don't. No.
including anything related to the Middle East,
Anything related to?
developments in the Middle East? What if
I
natural?
don't think so. I mean, in my opinion.
Good modeler's answer.
Joe, you mentioned that cryptocurrency was a priority when you started EIA, and then it became overwhelmed by AI. My question is, so that's a pretty big number you have up there, 17%. And I think you mentioned that this is hard to track.
Yeah.
There's not a big regulatory action around it. What do we need in terms of data? And is there any discussion about regulation? I know here in Western PA, some really old coal plants have been brought back online for crypto mining.
Yeah, we're honestly flying pretty blind. We don't know what's happening in a systematic way with cryptocurrency mining. So what happened was, in 2021, China cracked down on cryptocurrency miners, and a lot of them fled looking for cheap, reliable power. Many of those miners ended up in the US. And so almost overnight, from like 2021 to 2023, cryptocurrency mining alone became, we estimated, somewhere between 0.5% and 2.5% of electricity demand. Just like that. And I'm not talking about data centers, just cryptocurrency mining. Someone had mentioned earlier that on one of the panels, that they're very sensitive to price, and that's true. Like, their profit margin, even the equipment they use is pretty standardized at this point. So it's all about the price of electricity, and if they can find cheap electricity, they go for it. So many of them were clustered in ERCOT. We had started to actually build a survey frame. We had identified 135 different facilities around the country. And the way that the EIA folks do it is just like you would, Google and look for press releases, and they look at reports from publicly traded companies, and they started to build the survey frame. And it was my decision. We decided to issue an emergency clearance. You have to go to the Office of Management and Budget to get a survey cleared. There's a Paperwork Reduction Act to make sure that we're not unduly burdening industry. We did that. And OMB approved, and we started the survey to get it out in the field, and then a lawsuit was filed in the Fifth Circuit in Texas, and we had to pull. It's a longer, more stressful story, but essentially we had to pull the whole thing down, and we never reinitiated it, and we really in this country, we don't really know what's happening with cryptocurrency mining.
We have time for one final question in the back right corner.
So this is a classic hockey stick on this image here. Could you go back one more slide? I think it's one more.
This one?
Yeah, so that's remarkably flat demand. Is it just that the data center demand is so spiky and different that is causing the crisis?
I mean, I think part of it is when it's been regionally specific, I would say. So it's not super impressive here. You can see that there's a little bit of an inflection, around 2024 or 2025. The slope is getting steeper, but it's not going crazy. But the demand that's happening in, the Dominion territory and ERCOT is much steeper. So if you look at it on a regional basis, it is steeper. And overall, if this continues again, data centers and crypto alone might be, 15 to 20% of electricity demand by 2030, which, only a few years away.
Well, Joe, thank you very much for this wonderful keynote to close out the day. We really appreciate it. Please join me in giving Joe a round of applause.